All right, hello, Ranch Practicum participants. I told you I'd do a run through a slideshow on some infrastructure development things for range and forage management that we covered, and give you some ideas of things you can do on your property to improve the rest period of the grasses, decrease the graze period, get better harvest efficiency out of those, and do it in a way that's economically viable. So here I want to share with you some principles of things we've seen, different things some that have worked, some that haven't worked so well, and then ideas on what you can do. There are some principles though that we think you should follow. And first principle is don't use the tools from the 1800s. It's amazing how a lot of ranches their thinking is constrained to the things that they're familiar with. And barbed wire fences that are 4 and 5 and 6 wires and the old style water tanks as the only way to do this, it's really constricting in terms of what you can do, and especially doing it in an economically viable way. So we need to think outside of those tools that we're familiar with. Another thing is get the water development right the first time. Fences are fairly inexpensive in relation, and they're fairly easy to move. Water is not. Water, you generally spend a lot of money, especially when you bury the pipe, and so we want to make sure we build the capacity for the water right the first time and get those into the right spots as well. If we're using temporary water, then that's not quite as critical, but a lot of ranches that have done these and improved their grazing management oftentimes have to go back in and redo the water development after a few years because they've increased the capacity of the ranch, because they're running animals in larger mobs and the water needs go up. So oftentimes another rule is overbuild capacity in the water development so that as we run in larger mobs, as the capacity of the ranch improves, that the water development we put in is already there to support them. And then fence for ease of operation. So again, the fencing is fairly easy to change. The water development's not. So let's talk through some of these. We're going to start with water development and then move on to the fencing. So when we think of water development, one of the tools that we really recommend folks use is a water block design. So the old idea was that the tank would sit oftentimes in the middle of a fence line, and that fence would run across the top of the water tank. If this were the permanent fence, it would run right across the tank, splitting it in half, so that animals could water out of this side, and then they could come and water out of the other side. Well, the downside to doing that is that you limit the access to the water that the animals have, and so when you have larger mobs coming in, they only have access to part of that water tank. So the water block design is really a much better way to allow animals to use the full size of the tank so that they can all get access to it. And then it also allows you to have multiple pastures or paddocks extending from that water tank. So this is mine at home. What you're looking at here is this is the permanent electric fence. So we've got a hot wire, a ground wire coming in here, and then I use the electrical service. This it leads back to a charger that's a plug-in wall charger. So the fence essentially serves as a big extension cord, and then where this terminates, I stretch a poly rope around. There's some laying there with a spring gate handle, and we make a ring around the tape that's connected to these posts, and it comes in here, and then you can allow any of these gates, for example, can be opened up and allow the animals to get around the tank. So let's take a look at it here in practice. So there you can see the animals. There's two poly wires leading out. Here's a poly wire here. There's another poly wire on the other side of them. And then you can see the rope, the electrified rope that's stretched here around the tank, making that ring around it. So the animals have full access to the tank. They can come in there, get their drink, and the size of those is really important. So we'll talk size here in just a second. But a few things to notice here. First of all, the grasses grow right up to the edge of the water, so there's not that big blowed out area that you get when you allow animals to have the full access to it. So you gain a little bit of ground there, and also you notice there's not a lot of manure in here around the tank. And the reason of that is because the sizing of these is right. You want it to be large enough that the animals can comfortably come in there and get a drink, but you want it to be small enough that it doesn't become a comfortable area for loafing and for the animals to hang out and lay down in the middle of the day and then deposit their nutrients. So there's another view of it. Again, this essentially makes the wagon wheel type design some of you might be familiar with around this tank, but that tank becomes the hub of it. So there's the electric fence. So in this one, we're moving the animals around this way, and you can kind of see where former grazing sets were. Actually, I think there was one right there, and so these animals were on a daily move schedule at this particular place, moving around this. So they're coming over here to use this forage. So anyway, that's the idea of a water block. Now, this is obviously a productive pasture. These work very well in rangeland environments as well. Here's one near Lusk, Wyoming. So again, this is made with 4 posts. And you notice there's not a lot of infrastructure here. Oftentimes, people, when they put these in for the first time, I'm not sure what happened with that line. They want to overbuild it. They want to either use steel panels or come in here and make these a big heavy thing. It doesn't take much. If the animals are used to the electricity, you can do this with just single 1 or 2 wires. And I like the poly rope, the thicker wire. You can buy it in like 500-foot rolls and then put a spring gate handle on it. And it really allows you a lot of flexibility to make these a good size. So there's the idea of the water block. Let's look at another one here. This one's in Australia. You can see they're using the tape, the electrified tape, to make their lanes back here. I don't like the tape just because the higher wind, the tape tends to be a little more susceptible to the wind. One of the things they did is they ran overhead lines. If you're going off different directions with this, if the tape is not all up, it won't carry the electrical charge. So sometimes having another line in place, whether it's a buried line or an overhead line, makes a lot of sense. So that's what they were using. This water block here, I think, was serving about 500 or 600 cows. So they were coming in here, getting their drink, and then leaving out to their pasture. So we'd actually dropped this line here back behind where everybody's standing to bring the people in to see. So I'm standing in the side where the cattle are. They're coming in here and having their drink. Boy, my pen is going a little bit crazy today, so forgive my spastic drawings there. Okay, let's keep looking at them here. This is Ryan Noble, rancher from Yuma, Colorado. Put in a system, did a really good job doing it. One thing that's a common mistake on these is when you're running larger groups of cattle, people think, well, I know Dallas showed the size of his, but that seems a little too small for a larger mob. So I forget the numbers in this. I think it was around 1,000 yearlings, maybe 2,000. So Ryan put in a larger water block. You see that it gets some more ground disturbance. It also becomes a loafing area for animals. So you see more nutrients here. This is a fairly young one. So as this one matures, it's going to get more of these nutrients deposited back here. This is too big for a water block. So you want it to be a size so that one animal can stand at the tank, get a drink. So if the head's here and the tail's here, we've got enough room for a couple of animals to move behind him, and then you've got your post right there, and you're working your electricity around it. So let me let you listen to Jim Lindsay explain why that size is important. Jim's a rancher in Australia, does an awesome job. What you're looking at here is his pastures after 6 years of drought. So they hadn't had rain, significant rain, in quite some time. So let's let you listen to Jim explain it.
So what we found works is about 6 metres from the edge of the trough, from the edge of the trough to the closest point of the tape. I would be quite comfortable coming into 5 metres, but what we need is when an animal's sitting here drinking or standing here drinking, we need enough room behind a full-grown animal for a couple to scurry behind it if they need to, because if that tape's too close, they keep busting it from our experience. If you have it too big, then you need that tape just close enough to keep the awareness of the electricity in here, but not so much that they get too frightened to come in here and drink. Otherwise, what you'll get is shy animals taking too long to come in here and actually get a drink of water, so because they get so bothered about the electricity. So it's pretty critical to get this right. I think 6 metres is fine for us, but I wouldn't be overly concerned about coming to 5. And that trough there, if you have a look, I'll push the float down and you'll see it boil the water. There's the water boiling. That's about 5 litres a second into that trough. And I wouldn't recommend it for any means at all, but that will water 3,000 cattle. 3,000, probably 2,000 large stock units or 3,000 smaller cattle. But I don't recommend running in that size, in that mob size. I reckon about 1,500 LSU is about the max that I would ever recommend anybody go to.
Let's back up. Oh, here we go. This is a good spot. So, just to emphasize a few things he said. 5 to 6 meters is what their desired size is. So, from the edge of the trough, 5 meters or 6 meters yards is about the size he's recommending. And he said this one could handle 3,000 animals into this water block. He said again he wouldn't recommend it. 1,500 would be about the size that he'd recommend most people folks run in. Talks about Jim and I spent some time together. He told me it's something about the psychology of the animals. The larger you go up in those sizes, the more stockmanship skills you need. And about 1,500 seems to be where most folks can handle them pretty well. One thing I want to point out here, he's got the overhead line as well, and this hangs down off the overhead line, and this essentially serves as the deterrent for animals climbing in the tank. So if animals have their mouth in the water here and want to get in the tank to get cooled off or anything like that, they're going to touch this, which is carrying the electrified current from the overhead lines. So, oftentimes you see folks here, we build the structure around it to keep animals out. This to me looks pretty darn simple as a way to do that. I don't have any firsthand experience with it, but they seem to be real happy with it. So again, a water block design is really a key useful feature to make that happen. Many of you probably use solar. Solar is a great tool. Really does well. The real formulas you're looking at for solar are what's the recharge rate, what's the capacity that it's putting out, how many hours a day is it going to pump, how likely is it to pump, and then what's the storage capacity of the tank. So the slower the recharge rate and the larger mob you're running, the more storage capacity you're going to need on site. So oftentimes you'll see these with a large storage tank that would sit over here, and the solar would fill the storage tank, and then the storage tank would run out to the trough to keep up with the animals. So just engineer it right so that it'll support the size of mob that you need it to support. Deeper you're going to go, you're going to need more panels. Here he couldn't find tires large enough, so he put 2 tires in. This all gravity drains out, so it's on a slope, so that when it quits pumping, it gravity drains out and there's no water left in it. This is Rocky Foy near Glendo. He said he likes for all of his stuff to be above ground so that if something goes wrong, it's easy to service. So that's the idea with that. Here's some temporary water solutions. These don't have to be permanent. So there's 6 panels on a trailer set up. This thing pumps pretty darn quickly, and they've got a fairly large tank there. I think they were supporting about 600 head or so, if I remember right, in this unit. So these wells this is obviously sand hills, lots of wells around, but they didn't want to have the investment of the solar and the pump at each site, so they just pull the pump and take the panels and take it on to the next site. So they don't have to be permanent. Obviously, there's a little more labor involved with the temporary things. And then here's some of their uses for summertime, which are portable troughs as well. Again, this rancher said, I really don't love this. I'd much rather have permanent stuff in there, but it's a matter of what you can budget and what you can cash flow and how you can do your development. So if you need to get started, temporary is a nice way to do it, but generally you want to follow it with some permanent at some point. So he's got a inlet here, and then there's some overflows into some calf tanks that they take with them. This is Elson Fishbach from Faith, South Dakota, and he actually made a temporary tire tank. So he's got a plate welded on the bottom of this and some bentonite stuffed in it. He can pick this up with his hydrobed, drags it with a surface pipeline coming to it, and so he took a tire tank and made a temporary solution out of that. And this is another rancher near Faith, South Dakota, Jody Brown. They're on the end of a fairly low flow pipeline, so they needed a lot of storage capacity. I think they had about 400 cows in this group. I think they were moving about every 3 days. They needed some storage capacity, and they needed it to be a way that they could make it portable and take it around. So he took an old military 6x6 and also fabricated up a trailer, and this is what they came up with. So the surface pipeline feeds into here. I forget the number of gallons this holds, but holds that, and then it also flows into the trailer that's being pulled behind it. The reason for the sheds are algae growth and those from the sunlight. So they found putting sheds over that prevented the algae growth. So it goes from the truck into the trailer, and the trailer is fashioned with drinkers that hang off the side. They're on float systems. Here's the pipeline that's feeding the whole thing. So they just drag that pipeline with it. And so they've got drinkers, and then they've got a calf drinker off the back with a deal kind of like a creep feeder there to keep the cows out, so just the calves can have the drinker on the back. And when they move the animals, they just fire it up and drive it to the next site, and away you go. So I think that's really pretty ingenious stuff. There's some other systems out there that look like giant chicken waterers that are tanks with troughs on the bottom of them, and so they fill and come in various sizes and for a low flow pipeline or something off a solar that doesn't have a lot of flow to it, but you can make up for that with storage capacity. So I think Jody told me he had 24 hours of water for these 400 cattle on the truck at all times. So if something happened with the well, it gave him 24 hours to get it sorted out. Here's Dylan and Kinsey near Canadian Texas, and in the northern part. And they had a lease pasture that was a short-term lease on, so they couldn't justify a lot of permanent infrastructure, but it had a lot of old wells on it, essentially oil field wells that they could drop a pump down in and pump water out of. So Dylan fashioned up a generator, and this is taking care of 400 cows. So this is a generator that kicks on when the float tells it to kick on, and then it'll run and pump like crazy out of that. I think he said he was about 200 to 300 feet to water. He fashioned up a way to pull this pipe and pump using his pickup with this rig here, so he can pull all that and take it on to the next site. And then one of the challenges for him is they're about 45 minutes away from this. And obviously, if 400 cows on this, if something happened with this setup, things would go bad in a hurry. So he needed a way to be able to check it. So he got the hold of this thing called the cow cam and put that on there. And it's a poor cell phone service area. So it's got an external antenna. And about every few minutes, this posts a picture of wherever it's pointed, and he can check it on his phone at any time. So if things go bad, they can know in a hurry and run up here and sort it out. So there's the cow cam. A lot of other folks are using the Bushnell game cam systems. That's a little bit less expensive, but you need a decent service area in order to have that work for you. So here's his portable tank system for summertime, and this is what he built in order to move that around and get water to his cows in the summer so they can take it different places. So again, I just like the rancher engineering that goes into these, figuring out the balance points on those axles and how to do all that. So kudos to Dylan for figuring that out. So let's switch a little bit and talk about some permanent designs again and related to freeze resistance. Again, some rancher engineering here. This is Bud Williamson and his crew out of Moorcroft. Have really taken this to that. This is an early design, but they've really taken it to the next level of putting in some of these tire tanks that are freeze resistant, ground sourcing some heat. So what you see here is his mini excavator. They'll dig just as deep as they can go, put in a vertical culvert that goes down as far as it'll go, ground sources some of that heat, and then comes up to a tire tank where it services and fills that. So looking down into the vertical culvert, I think he said it's about 12 feet down to the bottom of there. The water service is that yellow cap you see coming in there, and that's coming in at about the 6 foot mark. It's got a quick connect on there, so they can take a vertical pipe, stab it into that quick connect, turn on the water service, and away you go. This is the system that goes down in there and connects to that quick connect. So your float mechanism is sitting down there at about the 6 foot mark. There's the float. It's connected up on a string. These are some they put aprons on, trying to cover half of it with a dirt apron to keep it active in the winter. They've changed the design on these a little bit, but again, it's a freeze resistant design that really seems to work pretty well. Here's the Levy here showing that mechanism. So it's a quick connect, pops that out. There's where the float operates, and then they've got a valve there. They can valve it for a surface pipeline to connect for summertime use. So the idea that these winter tanks, the permanent winter tanks, become essentially hubs and sources of water for the summer pipeline that you can run. This was a piece of ground of crested wheat, and they were doing some heavy, severe grazing on it to try to get some of that crested wheat renovated into something else. So that's what you're looking at there. But again, I really like the thought that goes into these. These guys are designing and building these for folks all over. So if you've got some place that you'd like to have somebody else do it, they really do a great job of that. Um, and then again, this is an early design. They've perfected it quite a bit from there. And then here's showing the surface pipeline coming off for summertime use off of the winter tank. So pretty neat designs. All right, so let's switch from water to fencing. Again, a couple of key points on the water. One of those is pipe diameter. If you think you need inch and a half, put in inch and three quarter or 2 inch. If you think you need an inch and a quarter, go with an inch and a half or a 2 inch, because what you're going to find is, again, as you increase mob size, as you increase carrying capacity of the land with the better development, you're going to run more animals on there. So always overbuild your water capacity, especially when you're burying it in the ground, because you're gonna want more of it at some point. So let's move to fencing. This is the old mindset of these barbed wire fences that were a physical barrier. I've $3 a foot is kind of a running number, but I've seen this as high as $6 a foot installed. This guy got a little carried away with his posts, obviously, but it's expensive. No matter how you cut it, installing permanent barbed wire is expensive, and I think we need to change our mind on this. Those of you that might have had experience with electric fence might have some negative experiences. When you're using the right material and when you're building it well, it really works very effectively. What most of us, our initial experiences with electric fence is using the wrong materials, using the cheap energizers, cheap posts, or using steel posts with insulators on it. Any kind of a conductive post, in my experience, is generally a bad idea. But when you're using the right materials and when it's installed well, it can be a very effective way to control livestock. So electric fence is a psychological barrier. It's not a physical barrier. So the paradigm that we bring to building electric fence needs to change from the permanent fence. So we don't need posts every 20 or 30 feet. We can space those posts more, because all that wire really needs to do is be held off the ground. It doesn't need to be rigid. It's not about the tightness of the wire that keeps the animals in. It's just about that wire being there and present. One of the things that's important is for the initial experience of the animals with the electric fence to be a memorable experience. So we don't want a little cheap charger that's not putting out very many volts or joules, and for that animal, when it first encounter that, to not have a memorable experience. We want it to be a well-grounded system with moist soil, and we want an energizer that's really kicking out a lot of volts and have a lot of joules behind it, so that first experience with those animals is a memorable one. If you're getting naive cattle into an electric fence situation, you want to have a training paddock somewhere that's close to the energizer, that's got some moisture in the soil, and allows those animals to approach the fence at their own on their own time, and for them to put their nose or tongue to it, and then once that experience happens, those animals will be well trained to it. So again, psychological barrier, not a physical barrier. The cost is a fraction of the cost of the old barbed wire fence systems. There's some basic things you need to understand about how these work, and if you're using a one wire system and the energizer is hooked up with the fence lead going to the fence, and then you've got your grounding rods that's hooked up to the negative side of that, to complete the circuit and to give the animal a shock, that shock needs to run down the fence into the animal, through the animal's feet, into the soil, back to that grounding rod. So you can see that moisture in the soil and proximity to complete that circuit is important. If this animal were standing 10 miles out in dry soil and all it had was one wire to contact, it might be pretty difficult to push that energy through that system. So oftentimes when we get drier soils or further runs, we look at a two-wire system with a hot and a ground. So when the animal comes into contact with both of those wires, it's just like standing at the energizer, grabbing the positive and negative leads. So that'll be a memorable experience. What I've found is most people putting these systems in, the energizers have improved quite a bit over the years. We've got the low impedance systems, and we can buy more joules for cheaper. Most folks are saying that one wire systems are working fairly well. If you are talking really expansive country and drier soils, you might still look at a two-wire system. But most people I'm talking with that are managing cattle are saying one-wire systems are what they're going with. So here's your typical permanent or semi-permanent two-wire fence. So we've got the hot and the ground. The height of these wires is important. This top wire is hitting most grown men right at about the bottom of their pocket, and the second wire is about 6 to 8 inches below that. For sheep and goats, it's often recommended to use 3 wires. That third wire is often a hot wire. We'll skip this for now. Just some of the ways that these are fashioned. You want to use good insulators. You want to use good wire. We're usually talking 12.5 gauge high tensile wire. Whether you use the crimpers or whether you use a tying system doesn't really make much difference. But your wire knots and the way you tie the wire is different from barbed wire. So you're going to have to learn a new way of doing things. And some folks have an adjustment period to doing that. They're really effective once you get used to using them. And again, you see these. It's not a complicated system, but we're interested in carrying that energy through the. This is a one-wire gate here, through the gate and all that. So, and oftentimes people find in heavier soils that one post will suffice. You don't need the full H-brace systems to accomplish these. When you're talking about line posts for these, you want to use an insulated line post, not a conductive line post. Many people, when they put these up for the first time, they use steel posts or rebar posts. And what happens is as these insulators or whatever you're using on that get broken, if wildlife run through it, well, now you've got a dead short in the fence when this wire comes back and connects to the fence. So using insulated posts is really what you're looking for. So whether it's fiberglass or what we're generally recommending now are the wood, plastic, composite, or hollow plastic line posts. They're a flexible post. You can drive them with a T-post driver. They're self-insulating. The wood composite ones have some texture to them and they tend to stay in the ground fairly well. The plastic ones are smoother and tend to pull out. So here's your typical two-wire fence for cattle. Again, a one-wire fence in this situation I think would be just fine. Yeah, again, these aren't tall and they're not real rigid. You could walk up to this post, grab it, and with some effort bend it all the way to the ground, and then when you let go it would spring back up. So you can imagine a herd of 1,000 head of elk running through this thing. There's going to be a lot of give and flex in that fence, and when those elk are done, that fence is going to pop right back up and be just fine. So these do work well in high wildlife areas. They're really resistant to that, and if you use the right materials, they'll withstand it very well. Have a lot of folks I work with that are in high elk areas, and they said they've almost stopped going around their permanent electric fences. One gentleman said it's been 8 years since he's had it up, and he's fixed a break 3 times in those 8 years. So he said it's almost not even worth going around the fence anymore because you almost never find anything. Here's your typical 3-wire fence. So this would be for sheep and goats. Hot ground, hot is how these would work. So you're gonna, if the animal touches any of these hot and grounds together, they're gonna get the full experience of that fence. This might be good for a perimeter fence, a roadside fence. Check your laws. That the only reason why you'd build a barbed wire fence anymore is if this is not decided as a legal fence for a roadside. These are going to be this is going to be a much stronger fence if it's built right and got a good charger behind it than a 5-wire barbed wire fence. This fence is going to be much more of a deterrent. Just a quick story about a Ranch Practicum alum who went through the school and said, "Man, I've got some of these high tensile fences and I hate them." This is not all that atypical to see people that overbuild these. So let's count the number of wires: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Here's an 8-wire high tensile fence. alternating hot and grounds. So you can see this is a hot. You carry the hot down to here, and then we carry the hot down to here. You can imagine if you get a tangle in this, it's going to make a dead short, and you're going to have a heck of a problem chasing down where your dead short is. So it's not necessary to overbuild these. They are not physical barriers, they're psychological barriers. You don't need to have them be watertight. This is Justin. This is the guy who went through the school. And they had these pre-drilled posts, and everywhere there was a hole, somebody decided they needed an electric wire. So it's kind of hard to see the wires. If you look down here against this cattle, one, two, three, I think there was 5 or 6 high tensile wires across this fence. And again, he said it was always getting tangled up and always got dead shorts in it. And look how tall it is. I mean, it's almost chest high. We don't need these fences to be that tall. Lots of problems there with getting dead shorts in that. Use the right post, but just way too many wires. Justin said he had one fence that he really liked and really worked well, and we walked out and looked at it. And here's a 2-wire fence in high elk traffic country. You can see there's a hot in the ground. It's built shorter, so again, it's hitting a grown man right at about the bottom of his pocket. And this is really good at controlling cattle. Elk across this, no problem at all. And you can see the post spacing. I think we're looking at probably 60 feet there between that post spacing. So nicely well built fence. And he said that one was no problem at all. This was one NRCS cost shared on out on the plains on eastern Colorado. Made them put up 3 wires on it, and it just became a tumbleweed trap. Once they got their cost share, they went back and pulled 2 wires, left it as 1 wire, and said it wasn't near the tumbleweed trap as it once was. So if you don't need the additional wires, don't put them on there. All right, let's shift now from permanent, semi-permanent high tensile fence to temporary. Oftentimes when we talk temporary fence, we're talking about polywire on a reel with step-in posts. So you'll see lots of different materials used on here. This is what I use at home, and I think it's really critical to have the right tools. You want a good reel that's a geared reel. That's a 3-to-1 geared reel. So for every turn of your hand on that reel, it will turn the reel 3 times. It makes rolling up that fence really easy. By the way, this is Jim Garish. These are pictures of Jim's, and this is Jim putting it up and taking it down. So a good 3-to-1 geared reel. The 1/4 mile reels are the ones you want to use unless you need the larger size for a run you're doing. You can see that carrying this 1/4 mile reel is no big task. If you're carrying a 1/2 mile reel, your arm gets pretty tired by the end of that. And then your step-in post variety that you use, I like these posts that Jim's using here. You want a post that you can put the wire on and take the wire off with it hot. You don't want this post that have a clip that takes 2 hands to put the wire in and out. So you want a post that's got a nice turn to it. These are the O'Brien posts. You can find the O'Briens or knockoff O'Briens now that are fairly about $3 a post. And really, once you use the right materials, you don't want to go back to the old stuff. Many people like the pigtails as well. I don't care for them as much because I like to put my wire a little bit lower than what most of the pigtails allow. But if pigtails work for you, great. Again, you don't want to use a conducting post. Rebar with the chintzy cheap insulator on it is not what you want to go. So this is us at home, and I've got the poly wire stretched out here. I'm taking it down. The cattle are spilling into the new pasture, and we're putting it back up. When you design the systems that you're using temporary fence on, you want systems that have short runs of temporary fence. Putting up and down long runs of temporary fence is not much fun. So I like to say if I can build it in 10 minutes, it's about right. If it takes me longer than 10 minutes to put it up and down, it stops being fun. You can see here that Jim says 435 feet up and down in 7 minutes. So if you're any longer than a 1/4 mile run, to me that's way too long. I like them to be quite a bit shorter than a 1/4 mile. Now there are some folks that do temporary fence on long runs. This is a gentleman in Washington, and he's putting up and taking down a couple miles a day. So he's got this contraption set up on his side by side in order to do it. So there's a spool. I think he told me that spool holds 2 miles of fence. He can drive it right out. He's got some of these smaller insulated posts that he can carry a big wad of them on his side by side. put them in the ground, run it through, and away he goes. You can see he fashioned a brake on there, and so it won't free spool, and he's got it so it goes through and makes the 90-degree there so he can drive. And there's the brake he fashioned on there, so he can put some wrenches on there and tighten that down or not to keep it from moving. And then he puts his electric 19, 20 volt electric drill on the end of that to wind it up. So there are ways to fashion these so that they can be installed from a side by side. But I think the better way to do it is to design a system that you build the perimeters and the interiors with permanent high tensile electric, and then you use the temporary fence to split those and to allow more paddocks to be made easily if you need to. And that allows the flexibility too to say different mob sizes of cattle. Maybe you've got a 100 head or maybe you've got 700 head, and you can build those paddocks in any size for that size of mob and where the grass is growing. So this is Levy Williamson putting some out here. They were building some temporary fence. This is in their early days of doing this. They just used some electric extension cord reels and put the fence on that. Now they're using the full either quarter or half mile size 3-to-1 geared reels, and you can see he built a rack here for a side by side and put it out. So again, if you're doing a lot of it, you might find one of these ways. I found I'm just as quick just walking it out and then picking it back up. If I'm only doing less than a quarter mile, I can do it just as quickly. So there's some ideas on fence. So we've got permanent high tensile electric. Really not much need for barbed wire fences anymore. Let's use the tools of today. And then we've got temporary fence that's polywire on geared reels with a good quality insulated post. So just get you thinking about what some of those designs are. We talked about putting out the transects in class, and just wanted to show you some examples of the power of these once you've got some years of data. This was put out in 2007. They were doing a Russian olive removal project on this property, and so we wanted to document the condition of the ground before we installed the transects. My house is actually right over here, about a quarter mile away. We did not own this property at the time. A couple years after these were taken, we ended up purchasing this property, but I was glad I had these transects installed so I could go back and look at these over time. So 2007, there the trees were removed later that year. So this would have been a full year after the trees were removed. There was some soil disturbance in removing the trees. There was the well to the property. The only real permanent water source is right up here on the top left. The animals would be out here for most of the season, so they would graze from the water out. So there'd be lots of bare ground spots created by continual grazing of those plants as they're trying to regrow. So there's our transect, the PVC post that we put in, and there would be another one down here. I just didn't have the tape stretched out for this photo. And an exclosure cage that we put in. I don't think there's a lot of use in having these exclosure cages, but people like to put them in. So here come back in 2010. You could see we've got some more population of the perennials coming in and starting to take a larger hold. We'd purchased the property by this time, and what we'd done is the first few years we've done growing season deferment followed by severe grazing during the winter. So we were bringing in larger groups of animals during the winter, taking off everything we could with managing body condition, but allowing these pastures to fully recover during the growing season. We did that for 2 years, and then we started growing season grazing. This is the same patch of ground, just looking at the perennials that are starting now to fill in the bare areas. There was no seeding, there was no ground working, just rest, allowing these plants to recover. And now we're at 2013. You can see we've had quite a bit of change from when we started, and here we are 2014. So again, it's not real critical the time of year you take these photos. Obviously this one was taken a little bit later in the growing season, so we've got taller stature plants, but even back earlier in the growing season you can tell that we've still got a good ground cover here of these plants. So it's one thing to be able to say, oh boy, you should have seen what it looked like 10 years ago. It's something else to be able to say, let me show you what it's looked like over the change. So I'll take you back again. There we go. There's the original. There's kind of where we started from. Lots of bare ground, not very vigorous plants, and with good grazing management, allowing for rest, allowing for recovery, allowing that land to heal in. And now we're actually running 3 times as many cattle as the previous owner did on this same property, and it's continuing to increase. So just kind of fun to see what you can get done. Again, put those photo points, and don't just take the photos looking across, but take photos looking down as well. This is Rocky Foy, the what guy I showed you with the solar water tanks. He'd gone to a ranching for profit school and decided he'd come home and do something about his grazing management. Wasn't liking what he was seeing in the trend of the ranch. Said bare ground between the plants was getting bigger, sagebrush was taken over, cheatgrass was taken over. Knew something had to be done that was different. So when he put the grazing management in that he put in, he went out in 1993 and he took pictures on some key areas of the ranch. So here's a creek. This is the old schoolhouse that his dad went to school in, and they took pictures, one looking up the creek and one looking down the creek. So here we are looking up. So they went into a pretty good drought in the early 90s, but he still went out in 98 and took the photos again. So now he's implemented some good grazing management. You can see that the bare ground is starting to decrease. If you go back to the previous photo, do you see any young trees? You see just a bunch of old trees growing around here. The animals were eating the sprouts of the trees that were trying to come in. So now we've gone forward several years, and you can see some young trees starting to show up. You can see that stream bank starting to heal in. And there we are at 2007. There's the roof of the schoolhouse. And again, a pretty dry time of year, so the creek had dried up during this photo. But you can still see the health of the land increasing. He also took photos looking down the creek, 93, 98, and 2007. Having these photos is one of the things that helped Rocky, and we helped put him in for it, the Leopold Stewardship Award. So Rocky won that for the state of Wyoming, and having these photos was really what helped do that. This is Joel Vad. Joel's the guy we're going to go see at the Maxwell Ranch in near Livermore, Colorado, northern Colorado on the Wyoming-Colorado border. So Joel installed some transects. Joel used T-post to do it. I think he probably would say there's a better way to do that rather than T-post. Those create a rubbing area, but it's better to install the transects than not have done anything. So Joel went through a pretty tough drought in 2012, like many of you did, and having these photos really helped him show his board of directors that helped manage the ranch the severity of the drought. So here was 2009, not grazed. 2010, they grazed it during the growing season. 2011, had kind of a tough year in 11, but then it was followed by 2012. So Joel said when he went in and talked to his board and said we need to destock the ranch, originally they were pretty resistant to that idea because they'd worked hard several years to build that cow herd into the cow herd that they wanted. But when Joel flopped down these photos, he said the eyes got pretty wide around the table, and he was able to convince them that we need to take some action. The nice thing is the land will recover. 2013, we had an influx of fringe sage, but by 2014, with some rest, those pastures were able to recover. So having the photos really helps tell the story. One more, this is near Torrington, north of Torrington. Gentleman I'd helped put out some range monitoring for several years. 2011 had a pretty good year. Needle and threadgrass really had a good year. And then the drought in 2012 on the same place just really helps show, oh my gosh, look at the difference from year to year. So the value of these photos is really helpful in doing that. Same thing, 2011, 2012. Just what a difference a year can make. So just a little bit of story there about having the power of the photo. So hopefully that gets you thinking about some infrastructure development and about some places where you might put out some monitoring and have those photos on your place. Look forward to seeing you guys in August.